Well, good evening, everyone. So thanks for coming along. This evening, we're going to be discussing Plato's dialogue Euthyphro. So were there any kind of general comments that people wanted to make first up?
Yeah, I really like this dialogue. I've read it a few times. It's probably been a few years though since I've actually read it because it's not even on a subject that I find particularly meaningful to myself. Just never having religion as part of my life or like the concept of bias, but I just like it's just an enjoyable dialogue. Like it has a really nice flow to it. Like you have like the multiple arguments or like descriptions that Euthyphro is trying to give to Socrates, and then they're sort of going through that, and then it's like, okay, let's go on to the next one. Like it's really punchy in that way. Like it's like next, and like it just was such a short dialogue. It gets to a lot of different ways to look at it. So yeah, I like it.
I think that the dilemma was just fascinating.
Which dilemma? Sorry.
About what the appropriate justice would be if your father commits murder on a murderer.
Yeah, there's actually something that's commonly in culture called the Euthyphro dilemma, which is actually a little bit different from what Socrates is actually talking about here, but we'll get to that, I guess, as we go through.
I found it a bit flat to my taste. I think maybe I'm a bit spoiled because we've read a lot of longer dialogues, and I just get used to the ebb and the flow of the Socratic argument. I really like it when Socrates gets in his stride and he has this long rant, and he just gets he just overpowers you in the dialogue. And in this one, he doesn't do any of that. He's sort of playing his usual kind of, I don't know anything self, and he never comes out of that shell, and it's like bleh. Anyway.
I thought it was funny because he's obviously being quite sarcastic. He says, "Oh, please be my teacher, enlighten me. You obviously know so much more about piety than me. Tell me more." I thought it was funny. I was kind of smirking a few times reading through it.
See, that's interesting, and I wonder, because when I read it, I just see him as a kind of simpleton in some ways. I kind of expect Socrates to actually be sincere, that he's like, oh yeah, obviously Meletus knows, he's a really wise man, he must know something. I feel like he's being sincere.
But isn't that what makes it interesting? Is there's so much ambiguity there? Like that's what makes it so brilliant and fascinating. Because there are times when he is genuinely, being humble, but probably more often than not, it's his wit and sarcasm. But we can just never be exactly sure when. It's fascinating.
And after that session we did with you, Judy, and Ashley, you were there, and about the introduction to Plato, that Sunday before last, or last Sunday. And you were saying that some of them are in the group of dialogues that don't reach a conclusion. Yeah, and this of course is, as you mentioned last Sunday, that this is one of them. That it doesn't really come to a finite conclusion. Yeah, so that and that's why I think that there's always that open-ended. He's playing along. He's playing Euthyphro in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Jody. Yeah, it's the aporetic dialogue. So the aporia is the Greek word that means a dead end. Literally, that's what it means. It means there's no way out. And so Socrates often, through his questioning, reaches aporia, and it's like, well, where do we go from here? Do we start again, or what do we do? Sometimes that occurs during the dialogue, and then it might take a different tack and go a different way. But here, yeah, we do find ourselves in aporia at the end. But that doesn't mean that the whole journey hasn't been worthwhile, and I certainly think that's the case here. Travis, did you have any overall kind of comments?
Yeah, I just enjoyed how sure Euthyphro was at the start, and even a couple of conversations or questions in, and it takes quite a while to get to the crux and then get the where there is a bit of a schism around what could be holy or not holy. So it was interesting. I just assumed that the fact there was no resolution was by design, which I quite liked, because I thought it was more of a reflection then for the listener or the reader around what are we kind of taking for granted that we really have to go a few layers into to really challenge ourselves with.
Yeah,
So do you
that's great.
think as well in this conversation, like Socrates is trying to sort of gauge what the average Joe's views on religion are, since it's going to be coming up in a trial if he doesn't understand why he's accused of impiety. Saying what is it that actually people think impiety is supposed to be?
Yeah, that's right.
There was one
Right.
other thing
Yeah.
I just wanted to flag. Like, there's bits in here that leads to the aporia where he's, you know, he just kind of hits these dead ends. But I always get a feeling, well, I got the feeling when I was reading this, that if we were reading another dialogue, like the Gorgias, for example, the kind of answers that Euthyphro gives, like, oh, of course, piety is the care of the gods, that would be a stock standard response that Socrates gives. But in this one, it's like, well, let's unpack that. Well, that's a dead end, you know? So I find that, yeah, I find the aporia a little bit disappointing when I compare it to how it seems he would use those sort of tricks elsewhere. That's all.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah. All right, well, let's get into it. So as Jody and Ashley would recall from the Plato event I did last week, there's a great Plato scholar called Miles Bernier, and he was part of the great revival of Plato, Aristotle, and the Hellenistic philosophers in the 1970s and 80s. I think he's deceased now, but he always said it's very important to look at the very first words of all of Plato's dialogues, and that because that will be some kind of guide to what comes along. And so the very first word in Greek in this dialogue it's Euthyphro talking, and he's asking Socrates what he's doing there in the law court precinct. He says, "Tine oteron, or Socrates gergonen." What new things happen, Socrates? Because he knows that Socrates generally hangs around in other places having his conversations. And in some ways, Euthyphro is very switched on. He's very smart. He knows about Socrates' habits. He knows, and it emerges during the dialogue, he knows about Socrates' daimon, his guiding spirit, because he mentions that a little way in. But on the other hand, as we're going to see, he's got some big blind spots, and he's very convinced he knows exactly what right and wrong are, and some pretty complex questions that he's convinced he's got the answers to. So, as I say, Euthyphro and Socrates are obviously known to each other from some time back. And also Euthyphro, he's quite nosy, right? He wants to know all Socrates' business. You know, what are you doing here? What's the whole story? So Socrates explains that he's been charged by this gentleman called Miletus. And it's quite funny how Socrates describes him with long hair, not much of a beard, and a rather aquiline nose. That's like an eagle, you know, a beaked nose. And the deme is like the Athenian tribe. So that's the deme he was from the Pythian deme. And funnily enough, even though it's a small town, Euthyphro doesn't know this gentleman. So he wants to know why Miletus has accused Socrates. And so Socrates gives this account of why he's up on this charge. And first off is, I think, was it you, Ashley, who mentioned that it's quite funny how Socrates says, well, you know, obviously this Miletus is going to do the right thing. You know, we should all listen to him because he's going to take care of the young plants, the young shoots of the city, and get rid of the people who are corrupting them. But you see, Euthyphro doesn't pick up that Socrates is being quite sarcastic here. He thinks he's serious because, yeah, he's got some blind spots. But he really wants to talk about his own thing going on. And he says, like Socrates, he often gets laughed at by people. And so he's identifying with Socrates. This is on the next page, also page 3 in the PDF. And Euthyphro says, I understand Socrates. This is because he said the divine sign, that Socrates' daimon, keeps coming to you. So this Miletus has written this indictment against you as one who makes innovations in religious matters. And he comes to court to slander you. The same is true in my case. Whenever I speak of divine matters in the assembly and foretell the future, they laugh me down as if I were crazy. And yet I have foretold nothing that did not happen. Nevertheless, they envy all of us who do this. One need not worry about them, but meet them head on. So, okay, now we've realized that Euthyphro's, he's pretty smart, but he's got some blind spots. He thinks he knows better than all the Athenian people about what's right and wrong and what the divine matters are. And he's identifying with Socrates. You know, he's trying to make a team with Socrates, which is also interesting. So with this opening section, did anyone have some kind of comments they wanted to make there?
Just on the opening, I actually thought of that because you've mentioned it before. My English version says, "What's new, Socrates?" And it made me wonder if Tom Jones was inspired by this text with his "What's new, Pussycat." That's what came to mind for me.
I was quite intrigued at the start on the amount of attention that was given to some of the examples around what's new, like the young and the old. So I actually thought that the dialogue was going to focus around some type of discussion around new ideas or holding on to the past, that type of thing. So yeah, that was my kind of takeaway.
Just on just what you were saying there at the start, like Euthyphro being intelligent. Like one thing I think that like counts in his favor in this dialogue is that he does like some of the dialogues, which I agree with Courtney, like where you have the longer dialogue, there is that sort of depth that it obviously gets into more depth. But generally the characters are like more stubborn as well. Like they're trying to like rhetorically find a way to kind of get away, but still hold on to their point. But Euthyphro's kind of like, oh, okay, I can kind of see what you're saying there. So let's try this now. So I think that's probably one thing that counts in his favor. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but this is on page 4, which is about the prosecuting the father. If that's okay to jump into that. Like when I read this, it's generally been like the way I kind of work around this is like to me it seems clear that like in a moral sense that you should prosecute the father for murder. But it seems with the way Socrates responds that like, well, this is very surprising. I think he says, I don't have the exact quote, but like, you know, oh, wasn't that good relative? Like you wouldn't do it for anyone that was just from the street or something like that. Which to me that just seems surprising. I don't know, like I just sort of mark it up as a cultural difference. Also, I assume their prosecution or their sort of trial thing is a very different structure because they're talking about them being the prosecutor. So obviously, or I would sort of assume there's not like a prosecutor in the sense of a city prosecutor. It would have to be a citizen prosecuting another citizen for something to occur.
Yeah, so that's exactly right, Shannon. Yeah, so let's get into this whole scenario, which is the reason why Euthyphro finds himself there. So yes, he's got this very complex backstory. So, and as you say, Socrates is surprised. So what's happened is Euthyphro's father has so one of the slaves on their property has killed someone else. So there's been a previous case of either manslaughter or murder. And then Euthyphro's father's taken things into his own hands and detained the killer, sent off to find out what the religious institutions think that he should do. And in the meantime, the killer dies. And Euthyphro's taken on himself to then prosecute his own father with murder. Now, Shannon, yes, you're absolutely right. There was no central prosecuting authority. There was no police. So it was a matter of individuals taking other individuals to court. And I should, just as a sidebar, until the 1980s, technically that was the case in Britain, that all prosecutions were private prosecutions. Now that's just mind-blowing to me, but that is literally the case. And so this was the norm for most of history, essentially, or where there was a judicial system, is for individuals to prosecute other individuals. Now, obviously, that means that only individuals with resources could do that. So I would say Euthyphro is quite well off. But to then the point about Socrates is surprised that Euthyphro would prosecute his father. Now, of course, this is, as you say, cultural, Shannon. You know, in Greece and Rome were very, as you know, as Italian and Greek societies still are today, they're very family focused. There's a lot of loyalty to the head of the family, and to transgress that in prosecuting someone close in the family is very countercultural. But it also, you know, it would make us think twice as well. You know, if your father has done something that you think's wrong, how likely would you be to tell the police or do something, you know, in that space? So I think it should make us think about our own reactions. But yes, so in the culture, it was an extremely serious step to take, and one that would surprise most observers, and not only Socrates.
And it would suggest, wouldn't it, that, because this is coming from a philosopher, so it would suggest that you must have a really good reason for doing this. You must know something, you know?
Well, I mean, wouldn't this fall? He said he got the who was it? The person who represented someone was going to come down and be the mediator for what to do with the original murderer.
Well, so what in the narrative, Euthyphro says the person who was responsible for killing killed one of the household slaves. So my father bound him hand and foot and threw him in a ditch and sent a man here, that's in Athens, to inquire from the priest what should be done. So the religious authorities obviously had some say in this. And during that time, the man who was detained died. So it's such a complex story. And as I said in my presentation last weekend, in a situation like this, where there's been 2 unlawful killings, essentially, today it would take a whole team of specialists, detectives, months to piece through all the evidence, all the witnesses, all the associated issues. And yet here's Euthyphro, he's very sure that he knows what's the right approach. And so I think we're meant to think this is someone who's unreasonably certain of his own beliefs being coincidental with knowledge.
Yeah, that was like another thing I was thinking about, like just sort of getting at that like what would be the legal circumstances that did happen if you had a servant, like a slave, kill another slave in a direct manner, and then they happen to die while you very carelessly detained them. Would that have actually been something that could be charged?
Well, that's another question. I'm not really sure.
I guess that gets hard.
Yeah, that's right. And slaves had very few rights, actually, in Athenian law. So the question is, and presumably that might have been some of the advice coming back from the priest, although that was overtaken by events. So it's not clear how that things would have proceeded if the original killer hadn't died in the proceedings. So it's so complex, and you kind of do wonder, was this based on real events? I mean, that's another interesting scenario, that Plato was actually possibly going off some real scenario and just making this Euthyphro the character to voice it all.
But you know, this idea of Euthyphro potentially being unreasonably so certain about this thing.
Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting contrast with Socrates, because he's doing something similar. So he's potentially seen by the public as unreasonably certain about the way he carries on. How can he give a defense of himself? And so that's why I see it more as like him going, wow, you're behaving really counterculturally. You must know something. You must have a lot of wisdom. You know something that other people don't know if you're putting like your money where your mouth is in the manner that you are, just like I am, because they're drawing this parallel between them too, you know, how similar they are, because they can speak to the divine signs and whatever. I mean, that's kind of how I read it, just as we think about it.
Just on the historical thing, I was just quickly looking at the Wikipedia page, and it was saying Diogenes Laertes says that Euthyphro was persuaded not to persecute, which sort of suggests at least he thought, or had, you know, in his own way he wrote history, thought that it was the case that this was actually a person. But it says there's nothing that's supported in this in Plato's own writings. So yeah.
The introduction in this Penguin edition says that, like, this island where it was supposed to happen, at the time that it was set, it wouldn't actually have been in Athenian hands because the Peloponnesian War was still going on. And so he's saying, well, did Plato just randomly pluck this location and just kind of make up the story, because it seems like such a far-fetched, ridiculous story that even though it's possible, it's the fact that it's not really possible in that location probably means he just made it up.
Well, that's certainly possible, although, yeah, there's usually some factual thing in the background here. Well, anyway, we've got this scenario, and
Can I
go
just ask
ahead.
one more question? Because you guys brought that up, made me think then, I know that the Stoics obviously aren't in the picture here, but if Euthyphro can be persuaded that his understanding is of the gods is incorrect, it kind of we know that Socrates isn't going to be as equally persuaded that his approach to things is incorrect. He's going to stick to his guns in the Apology, right? And the Stoics have this idea of catalepsis, that a cataleptic impression is one that's certain to the point that a person can't even be talked out of it. So I'm just curious about the interplay here from a kind of, you know, the Stoics would have read this later and thought about catalepsis, perhaps. Anyway, just another side note.
Yeah, I think possibly it would be hard for anyone to have catalepsis in such a complex matter. I think that's part of the point. So towards the end of page 4, and again, Socrates has been quite sarcastic here, I think. He says, well, it's indeed most important, my admirable Euthyphro, that I should become your pupil. He's going to learn from Euthyphro here. That in the past, I too considered knowledge about the divine to be most important, and that now this Miletus says I'm guilty of improvising, innovating about the gods, I've become your pupil. So he's going to learn from Euthyphro. And in the next page, on page 5, Euthyphro is quite amusing, where he says, well, if he should try to indict me, I think I would find his weak spots, and the talk in court would be about him rather than about me. So he's a bit arrogant. So it's this point now, Socrates starts to actually try and get Euthyphro to say, well, what is pious and what is impious? And part of our problem, I guess, in interpreting this dialogue is we don't have a good term or concept of pious and impious. So we could think about it as holy, because holy or sacred. But yeah, in our secular society, it's really hard to get that sense across. But anyway, I mean, in a sense, that doesn't really matter, because Euthyphro cuts through all the subtleties because he's so sure that what he's doing is pious, is in accordance with what the gods would want, because prosecuting people who've done the wrong thing is the pious thing to do.
What is the Greek word out of interest for pious?
I think piety. It's hosios. So Socrates says, well, he's being a defender because he finds it hard to accept things being said about the gods. So some things that people say about the gods, Socrates doesn't agree with. But Euthyphro even goes further than that, and he says, Socrates asks, tell me, by the god of friendship, do you really believe these things are true, which people say about the gods? And Euthyphro's very certain. He says, yes, Socrates, and so are even more surprising things of which the majority has no knowledge. So he's taking on special, privileged, secret knowledge about the gods that he says that other people don't have. And so Socrates pushes this further. Does Euthyphro really believe all the traditional stories about the gods, that they have wars between each other and they have love affairs between each other? Again, Euthyphro is very convinced. Yep, not only this, but other stuff. So Socrates actually says, okay, well, I should not be surprised, but you will tell me these at leisure some other time. So he doesn't really want to go into all those things that Euthyphro says he's got knowledge of. Rather, he wants to be sure, or he wants to ask why Euthyphro is so convinced that he's doing the right thing. So he tries to get a definition of what is pious. And on page 6 in the PDF, about a third of the way down, he says, Socrates, bear in mind that then I did not bid you tell me one or two of the many pious actions, but that form itself that makes all pious actions pious. For you agreed that all impious actions are impious and all pious actions pious through one form, or don't you remember? So this is the idea that there is some essential aspect which makes all these actions pious or holy or sacred. And Euthyphro comes up with his definition. He says, what is dear to the gods, theophilos in Greek, is pious, and what is not is impious. So Socrates tries to press that statement. And so he tries to clarify. So an action or man dear to the gods is pious, but an action or man hated by the gods is impious. They're not the same, but quite opposite, the pious and the impious. Is that not so? It is indeed. So they're in agreement for the moment. But Socrates points out, to remind Euthyphro, they actually mentioned that the gods are supposed to have had battles with each other. They're supposed to have disagreed, and they're supposed to have had wars and fights with each other. So what about if they had different opinions? And Socrates brings up a parallel case. Well, what about if he and Euthyphro had a different opinion about numbers or something that could be measured? They could establish what was right simply by measuring, and they would do that. Something larger or something smaller, something lighter or heavier, they could fix or they could determine through measurement. So what about the disagreements between the gods? Sometimes they disagree about what's just, what's beautiful, what's ugly, what's good, and what's bad. So according on Euthyphro's definition, they would like what's beautiful and good and just, and they would hate the opposites. But then sometimes they're going to disagree. So towards the end of page 7, Socrates says, so you did not answer my question, you surprising man. He's really a bit cheeky, Socrates. I did not ask you what same thing is both pious and impious, and it appears that what is loved by the gods is also hated by them. So it is in no way surprising that if your present action, namely punishing your father, may be pleasing to Zeus, but displeasing to Cronus and Uranus, pleasing to Hephaestus, but displeasing to Hera, and so with any other gods who differ from each other on the subject. But Euthyphro maintains that they would all agree about this, about prosecuting his father. So why don't we have a pause there for a bit of discussion?
Yeah, so this Euthyphro sort of accepts it, but I don't know whether it's true where he's got, you quoted it, but what are the subjects of difference that cause hatred and anger? That paragraph, that measurement. And I just think no, there's no subjects that sort of exist where this we don't have this difference of opinion that doesn't cause hatred and anger. It's more about the interlocutors that is the relevant component. I've seen people get in very intense arguments over things that are just that are trivial, completely trivial, and things that are slightly less trivial, and including measurement and adding things up. That has a whole bunch of stuff that could be disagreeable. I don't think it completely causes a problem for the dialogue. Because I could probably agree that people shouldn't have that strong of opinion, but in the way Socrates is representing it is that, oh no, like this is the way, at least the way I read it, this is the way people act. And yeah, I
Isn't he
don't
talking
know if
about the
that's
God?
no, it's just the end of page 6 where
But
he's talking to.
But these are quantitative things, so there's not really much to debate. You can measure something and you find out how heavy it is, and you look at it and go, "See, told you." You know.
But then it's
these other things that he's talking about, justice and beauty and the good and things, are highly qualitative. They're debatable, and that's kind of the thing. Like when he's talking about justice or piety, well, you can't just say the just is pious or the pious is just. You know, you're not really pinning it down to what it actually is.
Yeah, but it can be.
But Shannon, wouldn't that reinforce Socrates' position that, you know, he's saying, oh, well, these things can be sorted out by measurement. Well, and you're saying, well, actually, very rarely they are. Wouldn't that actually reinforce Socrates' point that these things are highly contested?
Yeah, well, it's more, I just don't think there are these subjects that don't cause hatred and anger. So it doesn't, I don't think it undermines Socrates' point at all. Like, it's just this, I just think it's kind of interesting. Because like measuring, like deciding how you measure something can be disputable. Like an example I could think of is like, how do you measure the distance between true train stops? So there's different ways you can think of that. You can measure the distance between the end of the train stops. Like it depends what purpose you see in the measurement. And that can be disputable. But yeah, it doesn't, I don't think it undermines or anything like that, the dialogue. So I don't want to.
Isn't it what's happening here is talking about the art of arithmetic or the art of measurement. And Euthyphro is claiming that he has the art of piety. So then, and then because Socrates is trying to go, okay, what's the form of understanding? What's the form of piety that we can use to decide if something is pious or not? So he's implying there that there's a correct way of knowing, and that's what he's searching for. And like, because Euthyphro has this art, it's kind of implying that it is an objective thing that can just be simply passed down from one person to the next.
I'm not sure he actually is implying that. Is there somewhere in the text where you think he's saying that about an art?
Well, because he's saying that Euthyphro has knowledge.
Okay,
and
yeah,
so
yeah. I mean, I guess
knowledge,
that might be implied that Euthyphro is treating it like a techne or an episteme. It's like a body of knowledge, but he's not. But yeah, Socrates is pressing him, and he's not really able to clarify that. Yeah, I mean, in a sense, maybe he is. He's almost posing as a professional on the subject, as if it was a techne or an episteme. Yeah.
Is there also? I'm just thinking now when we're talking about is this this dilemma or the story of suing your father? I'm wondering if that's like there's an irony because this charge of corrupting the youth, but it was like turning sons against their fathers, and so that's the irony of Euthyphro suing his father, and then Socrates asking him to be the teacher.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it kind of goes to what you said earlier, Travis, about the young and the old. I think that's a really good observation, actually. Yeah.
And we also get a feeling that Euthyphro has a lot more in common with orators than philosophers, because at the beginning he said, yeah, if I was defending myself, I'd make it all about Meletus, it wouldn't be about me. We'd dig up all the shit on him, basically.
And just one other point on this argument, like it seems to me that a different move that Euthyphro could have made is to say, oh, well, it's just pious to those gods, but it's impious to the other gods.
But he doesn't have any privileged access to which gods it would be pious to and which wouldn't. I mean, and that's part of the point, right?
That's true, I guess.
I mean, he's pretending to this privileged access, but Socrates is implying, well, actually, how could you have that? He's not, and I suppose what makes it more surprising, Euthyphro's attitude more surprising, he doesn't appear to be actually a priest of any of these cults, you know, because plenty of people in Greece were priests or priestesses of particular cults, of Demeter or Hera or Apollo. But Euthyphro doesn't seem to have any formal standing like that. And so whereas somebody who was a priest or priestess would say, well, actually, you know, in most cases, the god would think this, and, you know, leaving aside whether they had any basis for that, but they would at least have the cultural authority. Euthyphro doesn't even seem to have that.
So it wouldn't, this is like question thing then. So it wouldn't be like a common, it wouldn't be like the everyday people are like, oh, okay, like Zeus definitely knows this. Athena knows that or dislikes this. Like that sort of knowledge would be just reserved for the priest or like in general.
I'd say so. And in fact, people would go to some lengths to establish what the god thought. I mean, obviously it's a big deal to go to Delphi and see what Apollo says about your particular problem, or but there are also little minor shrines everywhere where you could obviously pay. There's always money involved. Pay and see what Hermes thought about your particular problem or whatever. So yeah, there was an established kind of communication system, if you like, with the gods, but it doesn't appear that Euthyphro is part of that.
And it seems that Euthyphro thinks that that murder is a bad thing, that all the gods would agree that murder is bad, and not only that it's polluted his father, and that if he hangs around with his father or doesn't do anything about it, he'll be infected with that pollution. So there's this idea of that the pollution has to be absolved through this act of justice.
Yeah, that's a great point, Courtney, and I should have mentioned that earlier. Yeah, you're right to point that out. So in a sense, Euthyphro's he's kind of clearing his own name in a sense by prosecuting his own father. Otherwise, he would be tainted with this idea that his father was an unlawful killer. So he's kind of trying to put himself in the clear with this process, along with, you know, serving justice, if is what he's doing. And so yeah, there's certainly an element of self-preservation or self-interest involved as well. Good point, Courtney. Yeah.
And it makes you wonder if it's only political or if he's also concerned about his soul being clean as well.
I had thought perhaps it was an element of conviction as well. I really like the start of this section. I do have a different translation, but the part when they're talking about, you know, what do you say? My version is about what is holy and what's not unholy. But Euthyphro does actually point to the gods straight up. So to me, it's like he's putting something above all else. So he's even moving outside of the cultural elements of like the family or the importance of that by prosecuting his father, because he says here is that I say holiness is doing what I'm doing now, so prosecuting wrongdoers. And then I've got in my translation, no matter who they might be. And then he actually points to Zeus, saying that Zeus bound his own father for the injustice of devouring his sons. So he takes the lens of, well, I've got one god as an example, and then he applies it out. And then we go into that exchange around, well, gods will disagree, but I saw that as he's putting something else above all else, and now is compelled in a way to see it through because he's got a characteristic that is more important than everything else. So he has to do this.
Maybe just
I think that's right, Travis. Yeah, and in a sense, you know what, he's taking on this divine mission in a sense, and that you know, gives him this certainty.
And just to add on what Travis was saying there with my question about why couldn't he just accept, like, oh, well, some of the gods would agree, some would disagree. Building from what Travis saying there is like, it has that more oomph. If you're like, no, all of the gods would agree with this, that what I am doing is pious, holy, or whatever. Yeah, so maybe that's also wise, just to have that like that punchiness to it.
But if Euthyphro doesn't have any specialist knowledge, then, and he's saying Homer and Hesiod, that's where he gets his idea of the gods from. Is this sort of reinforcing when that Plato thinks the poets are harmful to education?
That's an interesting point. I don't know, actually, to be honest. I mean, the stand in the Republic is one thing, but throughout the dialogues, Plato regularly quotes from the poets. So, I don't think he's dismissing their cultural value at all, at least in this context. But what's interesting, I think, is that at the end of page 5, as Socrates asks, and again, this is kind of countercultural. Socrates saying he's actually questioning these stories. And do you believe there really is war among the gods and terrible enmities and battles and other such things as are told by the poets? Are we to say these things are true, Euthyphro? So maybe Socrates is as impious as his critics have suggested. I think that's another interesting thread through this dialogue.
Yeah, he's definitely questioning the mythological worldview, its veracity, and also, to go along with what Ashley's saying, he does explicitly say that he disagrees with what one poet says. He says that fear isn't always associated with shame, and then he gives his own interpretation of it.
Yeah, that comes a little bit later. So let's so we've started asking the question about what it is to be pious, and this issue of measurement, which, as Shannon's pointed out, isn't actually as reliable as we might think. So what's the problem? What can we do about the issue whether some of the gods think an action is pious and some of them think it's impious? And so, to kind of illustrate and take the point further, on page 8 of the PDF, Socrates kind of illustrates his point by saying, well, obviously humans disagree about these things. So somebody who's, have you ever heard any man maintaining that one who was killed or done anything else unjustly should not pay the penalty? And Euthyphro admits, well, yeah, they're always arguing about it. And so, even though everybody agrees that somebody who's done wrong should be punished, what they can't agree about is who's done the wrong thing. They do not dispute that the wrongdoer must be punished, but they may disagree as to who the wrongdoer is. And of course, that's absolutely of the essence of legal cases in general. And so Socrates extends that to say, well, do not the gods have the same experience? If indeed they are at odds with each other about the just and the unjust. So some will say that an action is done justly and others unjustly. Is that not so? And so Socrates insists, come now, my dear Euthyphro, tell me that I may become wiser. So this idea that he's going to learn again. What proof you have that all the gods consider that man to have been killed unjustly, who became a murderer while in your service, was bound by the master of his victim and died in his bonds before the one who bound him found out from the seers, that's the wise priests, what was to be done with him, and that it is right for a son to denounce and to prosecute his father on behalf of such a man. So here Socrates lays out all the layers of this very complex situation to emphasize how many issues are involved. Come, try to show me a clear sign that all the gods definitely believe this action to be right. If you can give me adequate proof of this, I shall never cease to extol your wisdom. And so finally, some doubt must be dawning in poor old Euthyphro. He says, this is perhaps no light task, Socrates, though I could show you very clearly. So a little bit of doubt's finally dawning here. And Socrates takes this self-deprecating position. I understand that you think me more dull-witted than the jury, as you will obviously show them that these actions were unjust and that all the gods hate such actions. Euthyphro says, I will show it to them clearly, Socrates, if only they will listen to me. And we've seen from the beginning that he's had this problem because people don't tend to take him very seriously, as it turns out, as an interpreter of the gods. So let's take a pause there for any more thoughts about this section.
Well, there's that. I've got a different translation. I've got the Jowett. What have you got, Judith?
The one I shared on the Facebook page, it's the J.M. Cooper one from the 90s.
Cooper. Yeah, Cooper.
Yeah.
All right. But yeah, because there's that part where, anyway, it says in Jowett though, but because Socrates is saying, how would you show that all the gods absolutely agree in approving of his act? Prove to me that they do. Yeah, so Socrates is really going to expect him to show it, to really lay it out.
And isn't it kind of like a legal cross-examination? I mean, that's what this is. It's a court process. It's a pre-trial examination.
Yes.
That's what's going on here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how is he going to go in the court if he can't even explain to Socrates how certain he is, right?
Okay, so if we just go back to, okay, so Socrates sums up and he says, he's quite encouraging. He says, look, they will listen if they think you're showing them well. But this thought came to me as you were speaking. And as I'm examining it, saying to myself, if Euthyphro shows me conclusively that all the gods consider such a death, that's the killing by his father, unjust, to what greater extent have I learned from him the nature of piety and impiety? So even if this particular case could be established, it still doesn't really address the question of what the nature is of these concepts. And Euthyphro, confident as always, says, what prevents us from doing so, Socrates? And so he says, very generally, I would certainly say that the pious is what all the gods love, and the opposite, what all the gods hate, is the impious. So we kind of come back to this again. And then Socrates takes another move. Okay, so consider this. Is the pious being loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is being loved by the gods? Now, this is where we have what's generally called the Euthyphro dilemma in pop culture. Is slightly different from where we're going to actually go in the dialogue. So in pop culture, what's often understood by the Euthyphro dialogue is this idea that what God or the gods have decided is a good course of action. Has God or the gods decided that's a good course of action because it's actually good on a separate set of criteria? Or is it good because the gods have decided it's a good thing? So in a sense, it kind of overlaps with the issues here, but it's a slightly different. Now, that Euthyphro dilemma as to, what is it about a good action that makes the gods love it? It does cover some of the issues here. So it should make us think about whether our standards of right and wrong, whether they are to do with what God or the gods have recommended, or whether they're to do with other standards. So to take, for instance, the 10 Commandments in the Bible, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt whatever. So are they authoritative because that they have been handed down by God to Moses on a tablet, or are they authoritative because of some other criterion to do with civil society or social cohesion? And so that's some of what's going on here.
So
I sort of see the dilemma as, I just see I picked up on this idea of it's to do with semantics. To me, it was all about this idea that the action comes before the state. The act precedes the state of being. So it was all about the order, because he goes on about, if I jump down I can't even, sorry if I can't match it up very well, but Socrates says, well, now, tell me, is that which is carried in this state of carrying because it is carried or for some other reason? No, that is the reason. And the same is true of what is led and of what is seen, true. And a thing is not seen because it is visible, but conversely, visible because it is seen. Nor is a thing led because it is in the state of being led, or carried because it is in the state of being carried, but the converse of this. So I had to read this part a number of times to get the semantics of it, to get the actual ordering of his argument, which was really about, action preceding the state.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Jodie. Yeah, and so I was just kind of explaining there what people understand as the Euthyphro dilemma, but yes, it's actually about active and passive states, and the active act an action of loving or carrying or seeing precedes the state of being loved, being carried, being seen. And so Socrates is trying to get Euthyphro to focus on the order of these events. You're absolutely right. It's all around the ordering and the sequence, not necessarily about the ultimate justifications and reasons.
Yeah, that obviously makes a lot of sense. I was just thinking too that the example they give about being loved because you're pious or being pious because it's loved kind of puts the a question mark around maybe the criteria which you mentioned, Judy. The criteria could be the behavior of the human being, and that's what makes him lovable, as opposed to it just being already like predetermined by the gods, sort of thing.
I thought this is just like a logical syllogism. Reading this,
well, it is, but it's also quite complex and obscure. So if people struggle with this section, I'm not surprised because it is hard to get across. So yeah, it's all around the active and the passive directions of action. So we don't X a thing because it is X, but it is an X thing because we X it, if that makes sense. But where that leaves us is if Euthyphro is suggesting that something is God-loved, loved by the gods, theophilos, we still want to know why, essentially. That's where it leaves us. And so that's the kind of argument at the end of page 10 into 11. So Socrates is trying to explain to Euthyphro what he's getting at.
And if
sorry,
if we put it in behavioral terms, the problem it really is then, so what kind of behavior would I have to do to be pious? And that's the issue, really, isn't it?
Exactly right, Courtney. Yeah, because Euthyphro's position is essentially circular. He's using it to justify his actions, but he can't say what it is about his actions that make it appropriate or loved by the gods, or what it is about it that makes it right.
I'd say he has like an authoritarian position, which is, this is what the book says. The myths say that this is how the gods are, and so therefore these things are holy, and that's the way it goes. And I know about this.
Yeah, so the question is whether Socrates actually gets his message across, and I think he probably doesn't, because we see that after Socrates has tried to explain this, he sort of finishes off at the top of page 11 by saying, "I'm afraid, Euthyphro, that when you were asked what piety is, you did not wish to make its nature clear to me, but you told me what an affect or quality of it that the pious has the quality of being loved by all the gods. So that's like an attribute of the pious, but it's not the essence of it. But you have not told me what the pious is. Now, if you will, do not hide things from me, but tell me again from the beginning what piety is, whether being and loved by the gods or having some other quality. We shall not quarrel about that, but be keen to tell me what the pious and the impious are. And so it's not even clear that Euthyphro's understood what's happened prior, because he says, but Socrates, I have no way of telling you what I have in mind, for whatever proposition we put forward goes around and refuses to stay put where we establish it. So I think he's getting confused, finally. Finally, he's getting confused. And the other thing to say about Socratic aporia, and this is something that comes up in the dialogue Meno, which we did talk about probably a year ago or more. For Socrates, being in a state of aporia, being in a state of confusion is actually better than being in a state of unjustified certainty. And that's where Euthyphro has been. He's been very certain, very clear, but he doesn't actually have the justification for it. So for Socrates, for someone to be put into a position of aporia is actually better. It's more productive, and they're more likely to move forward constructively than if they're in a position of being convinced that they're correct.
And there's a story in the background, isn't there? I don't know it exactly, but I assume the things that are moving around, is it automatons in the Daedalus story? So it's things that should be still, like statues, but they have a life of their own and they wander off or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. So Daedalus was the great inventor, and he was able to make automata and statues that could move on their own. And so it actually comes up in more than one dialogue that Socrates' arguments are like Daedalus's statues. They kind of move around because people lose track of what they're doing. But yeah, that's the image of something that's moved away from them. I do feel sorry for Euthyphro at this moment. He's like, he was so certain, and now he's not certain anymore. And it's painful, but it's actually better.
It makes you wonder then, arguments, I mean, I'm just waxing lyrical here, but are arguments really supposed to be like stones, or are they more like living things that move around? You know, is that kind of something that they're toying with here?
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, these concepts are, it's what Socrates is trying to get across is these concepts are really difficult. It's not easy to say what's right and wrong in a given situation, particularly in such a complex one as Euthyphro is launched himself into.
I also quite enjoy the discussion they have when Socrates is comparing him to, I'm going to mispronounce this, Daedalus. Because Euthyphro basically goes, I know you are, but what am I? But a bit more eloquent than that. And it's quite funny where Socrates is trying to steer the conversation. Go, no, it's not me. I don't have the power over your statements. I'm not that powerful. I don't think I am anyway. Maybe I possess great godlike powers. I think that they're from your own statements, and the problem is yours. It's quite funny. It also just goes on for quite a while. It was like Euthyphro trying to go, no, it's not my fault.
But Socrates gets annoyed then because he says basically, well, in mine it says, well, but enough of this, as I perceive that you are lazy, is the word I've got. I don't know what you've got there. Does your one got lazy? Just after the end of the conversation about Daedalus, he's got.
Yeah, so I think it might come a little bit later, but Socrates is he's quite harsh. He says, since I think you are making unnecessary difficulties, I am as eager as you are to find a way to teach me about piety, and do not give up before you do. So whether you think all that is pious is of necessity just. And
then, that's it. See, so he's jumping into a new question.
Yeah, that's
so he's annoyed. He doesn't want to talk about the other bit anymore. He's had enough of that. now he's saying, okay, so tell me then, is it not that which is pious necessarily just? And that's where we get into this other discussion now in the comparison of what is just to what is pious. Yeah.
And then poor Euthyphro, he's finally reduced to saying, I do not follow what you were saying, Socrates. It's kind of sad, actually, at that point. This is the man who was so sure he was going to take his father to court for this, and this reasons, and now he doesn't really even get what Socrates is saying. But Socrates says, yet you are younger than I by as much as you are wiser. So this brings out that issue again, Ashley and Travis, about younger and older. Euthyphro obviously must be quite a lot younger than Socrates. And so Socrates makes that point. As I say, you are making difficulties because of your wealth of wisdom. Pull yourself together, my dear sir. What I'm saying is not difficult to grasp. I'm saying the opposite of what the poet said who wrote, you do not wish to name Zeus who had done it and who made all things grow, for where there is fear, there is also shame. So this is where this argument comes in about fear and shame. And this is actually just kind of a parallel to the argument that Socrates is going to make. So Socrates explains that people fear disease and poverty and many other things, but they're not ashamed of the things. Because shame and fear may be related, but it's not a sort of a direct one-to-one relationship. In fact, shame is a part of fear. So shame, according to Socrates, is a subset of fear. Just as odd is a part of number, a subset of it, with the result that it's not true that where there is number, there is also oddness, but where there is oddness, there is also number. So do you follow me now? He says, just to be sure that Euthyphro is still on the same page, because he could have just lost it from that point. And so this allows Socrates to make this analogy that just as shame is a subset of fear, so what he wants to say is that piety is a subset of justice. It's not a one-to-one mapping between the pious and the just. The pious is a subset of the just. It is a subset of just action. The pious actions are a subset of the just actions. So that kind of brings in this other aspect of justice.
Before we run ahead, you guys have got me thinking about this young-old kind of comparison, because obviously there's old traditions that are being spoken about here, and you know, the mythology versus well, is it really like that kind of thing, which is actually a new idea held by an old man, but it's sort of typical that young people are often quite dogmatic, so they tend to take on these old-fashioned views sometimes. But I'm thinking in this case that you look at Euthyphro's, you know, he's young, but he's absolutely certain, yet his father, who's old, acted so-called foolishly, but maybe the father is the wise one, because the father caught the murderer and bound the murderer so he wouldn't get away, but he didn't just go and punish him. He then was wise enough to check whether it was appropriate to do what he wasn't sure about. So he asked someone to go and seek help from a much wiser and, you know, like the appropriate source, like the priest or whatever. So in some ways, he might be seen, he's not really a character in the story, but it might turn out to be the wise one who's taken the wise course of action. It's just things haven't turned out very well. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think 100% you're right, Courtney. I think, yeah, absolutely. There's this implied contrast between Euthyphro, who's 100% convinced he's correct, but he hasn't actually done anything, by the way. But his dad, who took the trouble to try and see what the priestly authorities thought, and as it happened, okay, well, obviously he didn't treat the other guy correctly because he died while being detained. But still, he was trying to find out what the right course of action was. He wasn't sure himself. And yeah, there's this total contrast between Euthyphro, who's utterly convinced he's correct, and his dad, who wasn't sure. But he was in a situation where, and you've got to think about, he's on the island of Naxos, so he's kind of remote. He's got this situation where somebody in his household kills someone else. What on earth is he going to do about it? So yeah, he detained the guy and then set off to see what the correct religious response was. So in a sense, what exactly did his father do wrong, except, okay, the guy was exposed and probably not necessarily protected, but yeah, I mean, in a sense, there's
Well,
certainly a question
call it
about
deliberate negligence, wouldn't we? Like the fact that he didn't provide
yeah.
any water, food, or blankets was a
Well,
choice
yeah,
that he
except
made.
that all we've got at the moment is Euthyphro's word for that, right? So,
Right.
you know, again, we probably need some more information as to what actually occurred. And that's why I say, you know, it will be an incredibly complex case to investigate without much information. So, yeah, I mean, I think Courtney's point is absolutely correct, that the dad was, who we don't get to hear from, by the way. So he's out there on Naxos and can't speak for himself and can't give an account of what he thought he was doing. But all we've got is Euthyphro's account, which may or may not be any more justified than whatever he thought his father was doing.
I think it's interesting too, because it's coming from the perspective of, well, what are the gods saying? So you go to get the priest, and then Euthyphro then essentially doesn't want to have any reason with Socrates. He's then taken the viewpoint of, well, this is pious because it's come from the divine, and he doesn't really even want to have that conversation. It's like it's just a different level. There is only one response to it, like it's not even for a discussion.
Yeah, and just to illustrate, in the background of all of this was quite a history of, in Athenian culture, of thinking about what it was that the gods did want. So just as an example, one of the kind of classic mythological stories was about Agamemnon, the great king of Mycenae, who went to the Trojan War, came home, and was killed by his wife Clytemnestra. And then their son Orestes killed Clytemnestra because she killed her husband. And Orestes justified himself by saying, oh, well, this is what the gods want. This is what Apollo told me to do. And so in the background, there's all this cultural stuff around how, you know, whether the gods have got this authority about how you treat your parents, and whether the gods have got this be all and end all idea around justice, you know, or is justice something in human societies different from what the gods have decreed. You know, anyone can go around and say, oh, well, they can do any weird action they like and say, oh, well, the gods told me to do it. Well, yeah, maybe, or maybe there are notions of justice that are not to do with what on earth the gods thought or the gods told somebody to do. So that's also in the background here that's kind of important, I think. This appeal to the gods is a kind of a double-edged sword.
And if you think about it, in a sense, Euthyphro's actions are kind of based on an abstraction. If you take the idea of, say, the Greeks' idea of oikos, you know, like the home. So obviously the father is the head of the household, the head of the home. The slaves are a part of the body of the home and belong to him in a sense, and he's supposed to look after them appropriately. But one of them got drunk and killed another one. So he's wondering how to tend to the body. And in a sense, the son, who is under the father, doesn't think about the health of the body at all. He's thinking in terms of an abstraction, like, what would the gods have me do? And he behaves in a manner that isn't practical at all. It doesn't serve the oikos, the home. It just serves some sort of kind of doctrinal commitment to, like, a mythological understanding of what the gods would expect of him to do. And that leads to the destruction of his home, basically. Fundamentally, he's breaking down something of the most fundamental importance in their culture.
May I just ask one question before we move on there? Also about the issue of the old young. The way it's written here for me, it says, and yet I know that you are as much wiser than I am as you are younger. But as I was saying, revered friend, the abundance of your wisdom makes you lazy. And I wrote there, irony, ? Because I'm new to Plato and I've always been made aware of this idea of Socratic irony. And I was just wondering, is that an example? Is that an example where he says
100%.
Yeah.
Socrates is and this is why Euthyphro, I mean, a lot of times Socrates interlocutors don't get it. They don't see these being ironic, but here it's pretty clear, I think.
Because he's not saying that, because Socrates isn't saying that he himself is wise. He's just saying that this young guy, anyway, yeah. So thank you.
No, that's definitely, because Euthyphro set himself up as this authority. So Socrates is kind of playing along and saying, well, you're so wise, you tell me. And yeah, that's definitely a case of Socratic irony.
Would you not call that flattery, though? Like he's flattering these people to get them to continue the conversation.
Well, yeah, that too. Yeah, it serves a functional purpose, but it is ironic.
In that the Gorgias, he has a big part about, cake rhetoric is cake making because it's a kind of pandering, and then he's sort of doing that himself in a way. Yeah,
but you do have to be pretty tin-eared like Euthyphro not to get it right. Travis, you go ahead.
I was just curious as to the nature of the gods, if there was like a ranking or if they'd ever changed, because in the example you just talked about Apollo, for example, if you had someone saying that Apollo's spoken to me, let's go to war, and you get crushed, if people then turn around and go, oh, next time we'll go to Zeus's temple, or how that works.
Well, so each city-state had its own particular authority deities. So for Athens, it was Athena. So what Athena said was authoritative, but also kind of Zeus trumped everybody. So yeah, it kind of depended. And when it came to the rulings from Delphi, well, that was Apollo, and he was kind of the wisest of the gods in a sense. So there were hierarchies, but it was all kind of situation dependent. Okay, so Socrates is kind of, he's made his point about the pious being a subset of the just. And so that leads Euthyphro to say, well, I think, Socrates, that the godly and the pious is the part of the just that is concerned with the care of the gods. Now, this term care, which is something that Courtney and the rest of us have been looking at in terms of Foucault and Hadot, this therapia, this care of the gods, this treatment of the gods. And I think Euthyphro thinks he's quite clever to come up with this, the care of the gods, while that concern with the care of the men is the remaining part of justice. But Socrates isn't going to let him get away with that just right. So he says, well, what is this care of the gods? And he gives the example of a horse breeder. Well, a horse breeder knows how to care for horses, so to make the horses as functional horses as they can be. And similarly, dog breeders and hunters care for their hunting dogs as well, and cattle breeders raise their cattle to be as good cattle as they can be. So this is like that. Does it aim for the good and benefit of the object that's being cared for? And Euthyphro may be feeling a little bit uneasy, but he says he kind of agrees with it. He says, I do think it's like that. So then, well, what is this care to do with? Is to do with benefit the object of the care. Okay, well, yes, it is. Of course, says Euthyphro. Socrates says, is piety then, which is the care of the gods, also to benefit the gods and make them better? Would you agree that when you do something pious, you make one of the gods better? Oh, Euthyphro pulls back there. He said, oh, no, you can't make the gods better because they're perfect already, right? So Socrates says, well, no, that's not what I think. That's not what I meant, far from it. But that's why I asked you what is meant by the care of the gods. So what kind of care is it? And I think Euthyphro is kind of just clutching at straws by this point. And he says, the kind of care, Socrates, that slaves take of their masters. Socrates says, I understand it is likely to be a kind of service of the gods. So, well, what's the point of this service? Is it to tend to the gods' health? Well, for a shipbuilder, their care and their dedication is to make a good ship, and a house builder to make a good house. So what is that excellent aim, Socrates asks, that the gods achieve by using us as their servants? And again, I kind of think Euthyphro is clutching at straws here. He says, many fine things, Socrates. But then Socrates says, well, so do generals, and their aim is to achieve a victory in war. That's the kind of thing they're going to achieve. Farmers are going to produce food. So Euthyphro is kind of prompted to wax a little bit lyrical, and he says, I told you a short while ago, Socrates, that it is a considerable task to acquire any precise knowledge of these things, but to put it simply, I say that if a man knows how to say and do what is pleasing to the gods at prayer and sacrifice, those are pious actions such as preserve both private houses and public affairs of state. The opposite of these pleasing actions are impious and overturn and destroy everything. Now, Socrates is a bit harsh at this point, I have to say. He's not very polite. He says, you could tell me in far fewer words if you are willing the sum of what I asked you, Euthyphro, but you are not keen to teach me, that is clear. You are on the point of doing so, but you turned away. Once more then, what do you say that piety and the pious are? Are they a knowledge of how to sacrifice and pray? They are, says Euthyphro. To sacrifice is to make a gift to the gods, whereas to pray is to beg from the gods? Definitely, Socrates. Okay, so this is just to take a step back for a second. To beg from the gods, to pray is to beg from the gods. Well, that sounds a bit weird, right? It sounds a bit unworthy. It sounds a bit less than ideal. And piety being about giving to the gods, well, kind of. But of course, the gods are perfect already. Why do they need people to bring them stuff? And why do they need people to attend them? And so Socrates is being very provocative when he finally concludes. So piety would be a sort of trading skill between gods and men. And Euthyphro says, trading, yes, if you prefer to call it that. And Socrates says, I prefer nothing unless it is true. But tell me, what benefit do the gods derive from the gifts that they receive from us? What they give us is obvious to all. So the question is, well, do the gods get anything from our attendance, from our care, from our sacrifices? And then we find ourselves back at the beginning again, because Euthyphro is saying, Socrates asked, the pious is then Euthyphro pleasing the gods but not beneficial or dear to them? And Euthyphro says, I think it's of all things most dear. So we're back where they started, that the pious is the theophilos, the dear to the gods. We don't seem to have advanced at all. And so, again, Socrates is quite harsh. And about this argument to do with Daedalus, his arguments move around in a circle like Daedalus's statues.
This idea about sacrifice and prayer and all that is the old traditional view again, isn't it? The mythological view, because I'm not great on Greek mythology, but there's a story that they were to keep the meat and there was to sacrifice the skin and the fat or something like that, or the bones or something like that in one story, and someone tried to trick Zeus, or that story. And so there's this whole thing really around what is proper to give the gods, and this idea of sacrifice, and that obviously is important. Like, he's taking it very literally in a sense, whereas obviously Socrates is scratching his head going, well, you really think it's about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of somewhere in Homer's Iliad. And it's kind of funny, and I think it's meant to be a bit funny. The gods sit there on Mount Olympus, and Achilles is sacrificing a bullock or something. and the gods are sitting there smelling this amazing smell off the barbecue. It's like, okay, the gods are enjoying the smell of roasting meat. Is that what this is all about? What exactly is this all about? And so I think Socrates is tapping into this cultural, maybe, uncertainty about what it is that the gods derive from these practices, if you like, these rituals, these things that people do. How is it that the gods are actually benefited? So yeah, I mean, it's so provocative in a sense.
And also, like, there's a lot happening here, and it makes you wonder, like, this could have easily been a much longer dialogue, because, as you said, like, it starts out with, well, is it a bit like horses and horse breeders? Is it like that kind of a thing? And that kind of peters out, doesn't it? It makes you wonder, like, why does it peter out? And then he changes his tack. Well, if gods are using us to build something, is it like shipbuilders? Is it like carpenters or whatever? And then he ends up kind of dumping that one also. And these are kind of things that would get unpacked in other dialogues, like in Gorgias and things like that, off the top of my head. But that just goes nowhere. And he just suddenly goes, well, do you think piety is around knowledge of sacrifice and prayer then? So it's almost like these very profitable topics kind of get dumped out for this thing that Euthyphro seems to prefer, this kind of traditional telling,
But maybe that's because it kind of is at the boundaries of culture. I mean, I think that's what's going on here. Socrates has nothing to lose in a sense. He's already going to be on trial. He might as well ask these really difficult questions around culture, the gods, what the hell we think we're doing when we sacrifice to them. He might as well ask those questions because he's at the end anyway. In a sense, he's already on trial for this this supposed crime of encouraging the young to question these matters. He might as well push it, and that's exactly what he's doing, I think.
Oh, that's really interesting. So you're saying that his normal approach is kind of playful and tactful, and people don't really know what he's doing, but here he's just straight out going, all right, fuck it. You think it's mythology?
Yeah, I think so. And on the other hand, and again, we've got to remember this as well, two things I would say. The first is, if we remember in the Euthydemus, so I don't think we ever finished the Euthydemus, but we probably should at some stage, because in passing in the Euthydemus, when the issue comes up of ancestral gods, Socrates nearly loses it, because somebody, or one of the sophists, I think it's Dionysiodorus, needles him about, well, do you actually have household gods, Socrates? And Socrates says, yeah, I really do. And so he has a kind of piety. He has a kind of loyalty to these ancestral gods. He's not lacking that. So that's one thing. And I can't remember what the other one was I was going to say, but that's something to remember as well. It's not that he was lacking in traditional piety. It just maybe took a somewhat different form from someone like Euthyphro.
Just one other thing too, and this, like I said, I'm 6, so my brain is a bit fried. So someone might have actually made this point, but it is interesting, like that. It's like the start that Socrates is being charged for corrupting the youth. But if we take, which I feel like it is, that Euthyphro is no longer going to charge his father at the end. Like, that's at least the feeling that I get from it. If we take that as the case, it's kind of funny that it's like, oh, he's corrupting the youth, but he's sort of like, he's actually helping them in this dialogue, like work through the problems with his position and probably make a better decision, at least in the cultural and material challenges of that time. Like you've sort of been saying, like, it's hard to prosecute and stuff. So it is kind of funny in that way too, where it's like, oh, he's corrupting the youth, but like in this dialogue, through the questioning that he's being charged for as the problem, is actually helping the youth.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Shannon. So I remember the other point I was going to make, which is that however kind of irreverent Socrates appeared at one level, on another level, he was, at this very period, he was subject entirely to the Athenian system, and he wasn't going to challenge the sentence later on, as it appeared, he wasn't going to challenge the sentence that was passed on him. So he was actually a really loyal Athenian to Athens' institutions. And so that's where the great irony comes in, is that he's been charged with this impiety, this corrupting the youth, but he was a completely loyal servant to Athens, both in his military career at the Battle of Potidaea, Siege of Potidaea, other campaigns, and serving as a judge. He was a completely loyal servant of the city that then turned around and charged him with these offences. So that's the other thing to be aware of. And of course, Plato's earliest readers would have been completely aware of it as well. So yeah, there's a whole lot of levels here to consider.
And there's this huge problem here around this kind of dogmatism and reliance on tradition. And like, for example, you can imagine this sort of thing happened plenty of times in the history of Christianity, right? Like there would have been just really good people who were really smart and well read, and they were able to say, well, I'm really religious, I'm really pious, I really believe in God's love, and what God's love is telling me to do is to treat people well and forgive them. Of course, God is, not a three-part creature. And then they'd be like, what did you say? Did you say that he's not made of the same substance? To death with you, and that's ridiculous, but that's the kind of thing that happened all the time, right?
100%. Okay, so towards the end of what page are we on? Page 15. So Socrates is happy to go back to square one, he says. So we must investigate from the beginning. And that's what sometimes happens in the aporetic dialogues. Socrates is quite happy to hit the dead end and then go back to the start again, whereas everyone else is like, oh my God, I can't do this anymore. But he says, we must investigate from the beginning what piety is, as I shall not willingly give up before I learn this. Do not think me unworthy, but concentrate your attention and tell the truth. Because you're so certain, let's do this.
Oh, Judith, can I just ask one question there before you go through that section there, that speech of Socrates? Just the line before it, it's got Euthyphro says, in my translation, it says, one of the two must be true. Have you got something like that?
Yeah, so in the
and I don't understand that, because if you go back a few lines to where Socrates says, were we not just saying that the holy or pious was not the same with that which is loved of the gods? Have you forgotten? Remember? And he's bringing back to the original point. And Euthyphro says, I quite remember. And Socrates says, and are you not saying that what is loved of the gods is holy? And is not this the same as what is dear to them? Do you see? And Euthyphro says, true. And then Socrates says, then either we were wrong in our former assertion, or if we were right, then we are wrong now. And then Euthyphro says, one of the two must be true. But I don't understand. I thought he was saying I thought Socrates was saying they're the same.
Well, I think so Socrates is trying to sum up there, and he says, you should remember that earlier the pious and the God love were shown not to be the same, because he showed that that the state of being God loved means simply that it's loved by the gods. It has nothing to say about piety. That's a different quality. That's a different attribute. So Socrates, at least in his own mind, has established that they're different. But Euthyphro had been saying that they were the same. And so that's what Socrates is just trying to, I think, draw the distinction between his position and Euthyphro's once again, just to clarify that. But I think Euthyphro is a bit confused. So he's not really sure what he's agreeing to at that point.
Yeah, I'll have to read it.
Well, it's actually really difficult and technical, and I take my hat off to the translators, because it's really hard. The Greek is very difficult.
Wow.
So yeah, it's a really, and again, you feel sorry for Euthyphro, because it is really technical. It's really difficult here what is being asked to sort through here.
Anyway, sorry, I was
no, I think, yeah, no, I think it's a good point, Jodie, because I think it's, yeah, I think we all need a clarification at that point. But Socrates does this recap. And he says, if you had no clear knowledge of piety and impiety, you would never have ventured to prosecute your old father for murder on behalf of a servant. For fear of the gods, he would have been afraid to take the risk, lest you should not be acting rightly, and would have been ashamed before men. But now I know well that you believe you have clear knowledge of piety and impiety. So tell me, my good Euthyphro, and do not hide what you think it is. So again, Socrates has come back to this main point. And what happens? Euthyphro remembers he's got to be somewhere else. Some other time, Socrates, for I'm in a hurry now, and it is time for me to go. And then Socrates says, and again, this is suffused with Socratic irony, what a thing to do, my friend. By going, you have cast me down from a great hope I had, that I would learn from you the nature of the pious and the impious, and so escape Miletus' indictment by showing him that I had acquired wisdom in divine matters from Euthyphro, and my ignorance would no longer cause me to be careless and inventive about such things, and that I would be better for the rest of my life. Which again is kind of funny and sad, because we know that his life is not going to last that much longer, and he's going to be on trial shortly and executed. So yeah, it's kind of funny, and it's kind of a bit sad. And it's in a sense, I think we're meant to think, well, maybe Socrates is being charged by the same kind of people who are convinced they know what's right, just as Euthyphro is, but really they have no idea. That's kind of the subtext. That's what's going on, I think, or one of the subtexts.
Yeah, I really love that last line from Euthyphro. Just to read, like, this is a part of a summary I wrote for this text about 5 or 6 years ago. They've got Euthyphro claims to Socrates he knows it is pious to charge his father with murder, as he knows what God wants. Socrates gives him a slap down with his questioning style. Euthyphro leaves in a quick smart, has an important meaning.
What was that last phrase he mentioned, Shannon? I didn't catch it.
Oh, that Euthyphro leaves in a quick, smart, has an important meaning to attend to. Like that it's like, oh no, I've got something on really important, Socrates. I gotta go. Bye.
Yeah, he took a page from the, that article that I read from Plutarch, how to say no.
But you also get an idea of how annoying Socrates is, and no wonder that he's in kind of a lot of trouble, because he's a pain in the ass. He's smarter than everybody else, and he goes around kind of, in their eyes at least, making a big song and dance about it. And it must be humiliating for them, because I'm sure they know it. Maybe they try and take it in good, fashion. Euthyphro's not getting upset, but he must feel at some level like ridiculed or stupid or small, and that's not a nice thing to do to your fellow citizens.
And that's right. As Ashley says, he's a gadfly. That's how he But remember at the beginning how Euthyphro wanted to identify with Socrates. Oh yeah, no, we're against the man. We're fighting the same fight. It's like, oh, maybe not really.
But it's so wistful. It's so sad, like it is. It's such, it's like that little golden book, the little golden book of the little roly-poly puppy going, will nobody play with me? His little, no one will talk to him, like it's just, it's sort of like he's come to the end of his road. No one, everyone's annoyed with him, like he's such a gadfly, he's just so annoying.
It's funny that
punished for it,
It's funny that you see it so playfully, because I kind of imagine this done in a kind of Hauser's skit kind of style with like Socrates with a mullet, and he's like, so what do you reckon? And they're all like telling him stuff, and he's like, dude, you're a fucking idiot, mate. You're fucking dumb. You're fucked. I could just see like a really Aussie take on this.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I'll never think of it the same way again. But yeah, there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of folk wisdom in housewives. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of folk wisdom in Socrates, what he's doing. So, well, did anyone want to discuss anything else? Kyle, you haven't weighed in. What do you reckon?
I think
Okay,
that
fair enough.
was Carl saying anything,
Ashley.
or- Well, I mean, I guess, in Euthyphro's defense, right? He was there for a reason. He did actually have some business to do that day. So, I mean, you know what I mean? Like, maybe he just doesn't have all day, because you're never going to satisfy Socrates. He doesn't have all day to just go on and on and on. I think, I've just got to get this done and then we can talk,
Yeah, maybe. I mean, yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're right, Ashley. Nobody has all day to talk to Socrates except for the young men, the students who are essentially, most of them have got rich parents, right? That's, they're just allowed, they're at liberty to hang around and talk all day. So yeah, you're right. I mean, most people trying to earn a living do not have that time.
Because the next one, the next one in my book is the apology, right? So I did go on and I read the apology straight after this, and it was a really suitable follow-on in many ways, and I was interested to read about him defending himself, because the young men were going around and copying him in a sense and annoying people in the same style, and that would have been to his detriment. That would have looked bad, I think, for Socrates to have the young ones trying to copy him in a sense,
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Jody. And that, yeah, it must have been, that's how his accusers probably got their in, because all these young men were going around wanting to see people look stupid, essentially, which is not a very social way to approach things. But yeah, so I mean, we haven't read the apology. It's something we might do maybe a bit later on in the year. What do you think, Courtney? We could do the apology, and because it is like a natural flow on from the Euthyphro.
Well, we could do it next. We can withhold Descartes a little bit longer.
Well, that's up. What do you think? I mean, it might be good. Well, we've got this momentum on Plato to do the apology, and
I'm very happy for that.
Sure.
Have we done the because there's the three texts that are linked together, the apology, Euthyphro. Isn't there a third?
Well, there's actually four. So it's
four.
The Euthyphro, the apology, the Crito, where he's talking to his friend Crito, who's happy to move him out of Athens and get him away from his sentence, and then the Phaedo, where he has his last day. So, I mean, we could do all of them if you like, but I think certainly it would be good to do the apology.
Sounds awesome. Can't wait.
I think one thing on reflection of this text that I was kind of struck by is the kind of the smackdown that Euthyphro gets as well, in a way, but you feel a bit sorry for him in a respect, because you have to still act or do things in the world without a full understanding of the deeper meaning behind some of your convictions or belief. So yeah, you feel a bit for him in a way, because you still have to do things, and at some point your reasoning behind it is going to get questioned, and you might realize you haven't quite thought things through or have the level of understanding that you want, but you still have to go and do it. So, we're like looking at it now, we're kind of like, oh, this guy doesn't know anything, but that's kind of us all.
That's a great point, Travis. So I was just and it gets us thinking, well, and this is again something I raised in my Plato event. Well, is Socrates' method entirely, this method of aporia, raising all these problems and not really coming to a conclusion, is that a really negative way of looking at things? Is it a negative approach? And also, and to sort of take that further, Plato's Academy eventually lent into a really skeptical position. It was a kind of a very skeptical approach in the Plato's Academy going forward. That everything was questioned to the extent that its critics would say, well, yeah, it's a council of inactivity. If you're going to question everything, you're never going to arrive at an appropriate course of action. So, yeah, I mean, there is this negative and this skeptical aspect to Socrates' practice, which we have to consider as maybe a negative.
And
Yeah, that was one of the.
I was just going to say, in the hands of his, the Neoplatonic followers, it becomes a complete turning away from even, the senses and the world, doesn't it? Which is very sad. I'm sure Socrates must have been rolling around in his grave.
Yeah, that's I wrote a note down about that. The same thing Travis was saying. I was sort of repeating that, like, when Euthyphro is giving the examples for what's pious and impious on page 5, and that's a pretty valid answer. Like, it's not necessarily that you'd go from you have the definition and then you're going out to find the examples. Like, sometimes it's just like these concepts can be a bit fuzzy, like, where it's kind of like, that these things fall under it, but then you don't have like there's not a proposition that you have, and it's hard to actually pin down a punchy proposition that you usually have in these type of dialogues that's fully going to capture the concept. It'd be almost faulty to try to do that. So it does have this sort of assumption of like, or maybe not assumption, but it does sometimes feel like it's sort of like it prioritizes having the proposition of the thing, rather than, it's like sometimes it's enough to just be able to cite the things correct, like use the word correctly or use the concept correctly, and that does show at least some level of understanding. It wouldn't be a full understanding, like maybe having a propositional knowledge is like that, it's an extra layer on top of it, but it still is some level of knowledge or understanding of it.
I think Euthyphro's a dickhead. I can't relate at all to feeling sorry for him. And, the whole thing is about he's boastful and arrogant, and he takes pride in his knowledge. And so Socrates is there to humble him or humiliate him, either however you want to look at it. And he's not, the skeptical thing's not really an issue because he's such an embodied person, and he does live his life virtuously, that he's not a wanker just going around all in his head doing nothing and just criticizing people.
But there's this that one of the early parts, I think it's it'll be on about bottom of page 3 or thereabouts, I think, on yours. Mine's a bit different, but there's a line here where Euthyphro says, Socrates says, "Good heavens, Euthyphro, is your knowledge of religion and of things pious and impious so very exact that, supposing the circumstances to be as you state them, you are not afraid lest you too may be doing an impious thing in bringing an action against your father?" And Euthyphro says, the best of Euthyphro, like referring to himself, his own name. Does it say that in yours too? The best of Euthyphro, and that which distinguishes him, Socrates, from other men is his exact knowledge of all matters, like talking about himself in the third person.
Yeah, it's kind of there in this translation, although it's not quite like that. So I'm suspecting there might be a textual issue there. So in our translation, it says, Euthyphro says, "I should be of no use, Socrates, and Euthyphro would not be superior to the majority of men if I did not have accurate knowledge of all such things." So yeah, he kind of talks about himself in the third person. It's weird, isn't it? But that, when people talk about themselves in the third person, it's a bit of a red flag. I'm trying to think who else does that. There's some famous person who does it. I can't even think who it is. But yeah, it's meant to be a red flag, I think.
But I think you guys are really right, and Travis makes that really good point, that Socrates is really exposing ourselves to ourselves when he does this with people, and in a way it's almost like we're made this way, because they talk about, you know, even in modern psychology, that whatever beliefs you have, you tend to go out and try and look for evidence to support. That's just the way kind of we tend to be made, and it helps us to create predictable environments for ourselves. We look for things that will support our understanding of the world. But Socrates is a real strange character. He's inverted the natural kind of tendency for that human beings have, and instead he's constantly skeptical. He's able to have this aporia, and that's remarkably difficult for anybody. So I mean, you know, Ashley, when you say he's a dickhead, you're really talking about me and everyone else, because we all do it, you know. So that's the trouble, and that's, I think, what's so smart about Socrates, but also kind of mean as well, because yeah, we can't help it. We're trying our best, but maybe that's the thing, is that Euthyphro is unaware of that, and so when he's not aware of his ignorance, he ends up doing really shit stuff, like, you know, suing his father, for example.
Yeah, and another thing that just struck me too is, you know, again, Plato is so ahead of his time, right? So crime fiction didn't become a thing until the 19th century. But here's Plato giving us this amazing crime scene. And because, you know, again, he knows that what we do is respond to a crime story, right? We see this with true crime. We see this with famous crime cases on the television. We all have a reaction. We think, oh, that guy's a bastard, or oh, she shouldn't have done that. You know, that's what we all think. That's our reaction, because we're all Euthyphro. We all think we know what the hell's going on, when in fact we don't. We don't know the details. We don't know the evidence. We don't know the people involved. We don't know what's happened. But Plato has pegged us already as knowing, or as thinking we know what the right thing is in all these complex situations. I just think it's incredible that not content with mastering the drama, the narrative, the myth, and the philosophical dialogue, he's also now mastered the true crime narrative.
Yeah, it's just a great dialogue. Like, it's so much fun. Like, there's just something about, like I was saying at the start, it's so punchy. It's so, like, you have like Socrates sort of steering the conversation where he's, you know, he's kind of making fun of him a little bit, but then it's sort of like pulling it back and going like, okay, like, let's redirect the conversation so we don't get stuck on this. It's just such a good dialogue. Like, I don't even think there's like, I think like the quality of the dialogue is what makes it interesting for me. Like, I don't think the questions that they're like academically interesting for me. They're like talking about comic book characters. But it just elevates it so much of just the quality of how it's written.
Well, that seems like a great place to finish off. So thanks everybody for coming and talking about Euthyphro, which is, yeah, one of my favorite dialogues as well. I think it's so good. So next time we'll do the apology. Sounds like a plan. Thanks, Jody, for the suggestion.
Thanks, everyone. Bye
No worries.
bye.
Thanks.
See you later.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.